Thank you, Josh. It's lovely to be here, and I really appreciate having been invited. I've been head student now for between 5 and 6 months, and I think, gosh, between 5 and 6 months already. And it's been a fascinating journey. This talk is called Not Knowing and Not Doing. And Trudy said to me the other day that becoming head student is in some way like an initiation. And the image in my mind of an initiation is of passing through a doorway, and you don't know what's on the other side of the door. And I'm certainly discovering things about myself, and learning, of course, about what being head student means. There isn't a prescribed shape for being head student, although 3 elements can be discerned. Firstly, offering tea, meetings for tea, one-to-one, which I'm finding a lovely thing to do, meeting one-to-one with people that I wouldn't otherwise meet with in that way. Giving classes is the second, and the third is giving Dharma talks. As I turned my mind towards the idea of giving one or more Dharma talks, what arose in me was, I haven't got anything to say. I really am not naturally somebody who sees Dharma talks in everyday events that happen, or in anything else that for that matter. And so I started trying to come up with something. And after trying for a fair while, what arose in me was, I can't find anything to craft a Dharma talk from. And I don't want to be doing this anyway. At a certain point, I realized that I was trying to fit the role. I wasn't being myself. And ever since being head student, and but before becoming head student, I have recalled what Lynn said to me as I was heading towards being made head student, which was be yourself. When I realized that I wasn't being myself, I allowed myself to let go of the trying to find a Dharma talk, and allowed the I don't know what I have that I can say to be there. And something sort of naturally became freed up, and lo and behold, a Dharma talk was just there, which has actually felt easy, even enjoyable to write. I've had enthusiasm for it, and is me expressing myself. Joko Beck wrote this, and it really speaks to me. There is a darkness out of which everything comes, an endless creative potential that's pouring out of our life at every second. Practice is about going into that darkness. We have a tendency to fear that darkness. And it may be that the deepest reason for that is the awful possibility that there is nothing there at all. And there is a way in which there is nothing there in that darkness, until the unforceable moment when something arises out of that endless creative potential. And two images for that, for darkness, I have in mind. One is the sort of empty wasteland of interstellar space sort of darkness. Two images for the darkness and the emptiness of that interstellar space. And the second is the emptiness of a womb. And it has always seemed to me that the emptiness that I'm talking about is much more like the second than the first, that the womb starts empty and all of a sudden something new, completely new, and in some ways not new, just is created, comes into being. And it needs a quality of trust to stay in that place when we don't know what, if anything, will arise. The journey into and through the darkness comes in many sizes, from the big D, death, via a burnout or a nervous breakdown, to use the common language, or any unsettling change, down to little life events that require a shift in our perception. Frank Ostaseski, in his book, The Five Invitations, says, dying is a stripping away process, a release, a surrender, a change that holds profound possibilities. And I would like to add, please include within the meaning of the word dying all the life experiences which have this quality of letting go into a place of not knowing, of darkness. And just as a little random aside, somebody said, thinking of the word surrender, somebody said to me the other day that our practice is to surrender without surrendering. And that is one of the sayings. I have a number of sayings that I've sort of tucked into my metaphorical top pocket to carry around with me. Ostaseski goes on to say, transience is in the nature of all experience. We know that. Yet change itself doesn't guarantee transformation. Transformation is a deep internal shift through which our basic identities are reconstituted. And again, please translate that as meaning within experiences, small, medium, and large. And small experiences obviously don't require a complete transformation of our whole being, but they do require some transformation, some transformative shift from a previous way of seeing the world to a new way of seeing the world. He goes on to say, we see and experience everything in a new way. The transformation of our consciousness, which is possible for each of us in our day-to-day lives, requires our active engagement. We cannot think our way through it. Transformation requires an open-ended willingness to be fully vulnerable to the experience of the unknown. Change itself doesn't guarantee transformation. It is a crisis point, and the original meaning of the word crisis from the Greek is the turning point of a sickness, where we either get better or we die, a crossroads. And in the context that I'm talking about, it's the point at which we either enter the vulnerability to the experience of the unknown, to use Ostaseski's phrase, or we play safe. by staying with what we know or what we think we know, and missing that particular opportunity to grow and to become a larger container for life. Two examples were given at Nothing Special Friday meeting the other week. We've been reading Ostaseski's book. He listening to one of his talks, which was really a lovely, lovely talk. He recounted a story of when he said something that was, in his words, bullshit. He told of having been with somebody ill with AIDS who knocked over a glass of milk. And Frank said, "Don't worry, it's not a big deal." And the person with AIDS said with passion, "It is a big deal." And my guess is that that was because it may have been a harbinger of loss of control of his body. And in the reflection afterwards, Judy Parfitt told of someone who was with a friend who had just lost someone dear to them. And the friend said, I can't imagine what you're going through. And the friend said, "Well, just try." And in both of these instances, it seems to me, the responses may well have come from a defensiveness, an unwillingness to connect directly with the experience of the other person. And that what was actually called for was to simply be with the other person, be present in a place of not knowing, and for them to open to the felt sense of what was being called for in the moment. It's often scary to a lesser or greater extent because it is a place of letting go, of realizing one has lost a familiar landscape which we know our way around, and of allowing ourselves to be in that place of not knowing, which includes the possibility that nothing will arise and we will be left with no way of knowing how to be or what to do other than going back to our familiar ways that we can call on, that we're familiar, that we probably know only too well. A lot of my own journey is still to do with a long, slow, stop and start, forward and back transformation from pushing and trying towards letting and allowing and trusting. And I really feel I started from a fairly low base. Here are a couple of my life experiences to illustrate. Circumstances as a child led me to being driven in life and having to know, mainly having to know how to do things. And if I didn't know, then I had to work it out or find it out. In my 20s, I went to Sri Lanka to be the assistant director of a small technical institute. I went because I thought I knew that technology appropriate to a culture was going to, as it were, save the world. And that there were other ways other than that, thinking that I knew the truth, as it were, in which my way of being was almost totally at odds with the Zen way. I felt very separate from the world. There was me and there was the world, and I felt very alone. And the word support wasn't anywhere in my vocabulary. So taking refuge in Sangha well, I'd never heard the phrase. It just wasn't in my vocabulary. I knew very little about what I felt in myself, what my feelings were, beyond that I knew I was afraid of people. My responses to situations were pretty strongly not appropriate responses. And at a certain point in Sri Lanka, I was going to say sort of reached the end of the road, but I just did reach the end of the road that I had pushed my way along for the bulk of my life up till then. And I couldn't mentally or physically carry on like that. And I came back to the UK, not able to face meeting people at all. Even so, and this is something I find amazing and extraordinary and wonderful, actually, even just with all that, the experiences that life brought me there, some of which were of my unconscious, albeit unconscious making, and some of which were in no way of my making, led me to a place which was essential for my growth. My life of knowing and trying desperately hard led me to a place of having to stop trying because I had reached the end of the road, and not knowing because my old ways of understanding life had just collapsed. I was forced to stop and just be. And while that time of doing had been really painful, this new time was even more painful. And I've been reflecting on what was so painful. And it was the combination of feeling completely on my own, together with the fact that I didn't know what I felt beyond the fact that something felt very painful. I didn't know who I was, didn't know how to share myself with other people, didn't know how to be with people at all, very largely. And if the Zen way is intimacy with all things and an appropriate response, that was more or less the polar opposite. I see intimacy as a not knowing in connection with the world. And what I felt was that I was in a place of not knowing while being totally out of connection with the world. Although actually from my perspective now, I would say that I was in a place of merely feeling that I was out of connection with the world. All I could do at that time was just to be with how I was. I didn't have any other option. And to hold on to the sense that I had, the trust that something good, something new could come out of that time of enforced not knowing and not doing. And something did arise out of that endless creative potential, which could only emerge when I had been forced to stop doing and to give up knowing. And I just have such gratitude for that. The way in which that happens, that can happen. That sudden, unforced, bringing into being, creative bringing into being of, or emergence into being of something. There's another example on the same theme, which was during my Hakomi training. And the story shows very clearly how ridiculous it is to hold on to doing when non-doing is what is required. And Hakomi is all about non-doing, allowing to happen what wants to happen. And me being me, I spent quite some years trying desperately hard not to try. And you can imagine how well that panned out and how effective that was. And at a certain point, I just felt I couldn't carry on doing that. And I just gave up trying. And again, shifted into a new landscape where I could be much more simply and fully present and pay attention and respond from a combination of whatever skillfulness in Hakomi I had learned, together with a response from my own felt sense. We cling so faithfully to our habits and beliefs. We so faithfully. And we try and control life out of a deep fearfulness, which is sort of dyed in the wool into our bodies and minds. And this leads to our belief that we have to control life and shape life in pummel life into the shape that we think will make us happy. And that either we feel we know what to do with regard to that, or if we don't know, we need to find out. Or maybe I'm just talking about myself and my own path. Certainly, the examples I gave were underpinned by fearfulness. The first, when I was in Sri Lanka, was the underlying fear was a fear for survival, actually. And in the Hakomi example, it was a fear of what other people would think of me. I wanted to be seen to be a good and capable Hakomi practitioner. And I am so glad for that experience of, again, being pretty much forced to let go of that trying and just show up as me. And that was another of a number of wonderful teachings that Hakomi gave me of just being able to fess up to being me, and as we know, this chimes so well with our Zen practice. Back then, I didn't have enough perspective to be able to characterize it at the time, but looking back, I can see that this letting go was both a letting go of little I agenda, ego agenda, into a larger awareness, big mind, letting go into big mind, at least to some extent, and also a resting into shared humanness. It was both at the same time, both expansive and simply human at the same time. Ron Kurtz, the founder of Hakomi, wrote in his wonderful book, written together with Greg Johansson, his wonderful book, Psychotherapy in the Spirit of the Tao Te Ching, he wrote, together, non-being and non-doing support non-violence. Non-violence is an attitude of trust, there's that word again, in the creation. Trust, an attitude of trust in the creation. It's a commitment to not interfere with the processes of life Well, there's an easy project, eh? But to celebrate their spontaneous organic intelligence. Non-violence promotes a respect for the subtle, almost imperceptible movements of mind and body and spirit, and gives rise to a yielding or softness which follows and nourishes these movements rather than correcting or conquering them. Coming now to our Zen practice, here's Joko Beck again. We want to stay where we're used to. Just think of anything in your life and notice that the only way you handle it is the way you're used to handling it. As human beings, we like things to be fixed. We're always trying to control the world so we can be safe. There's that with, of course, that underlying fear again, and at bottom it's fear, it's an existential fear. But in doing so, we make the world very small and seemingly more manageable. And just as an aside, for a long time, I've thought that this Zen practice of ours is a really heroic venture. I mean, to turn towards that fear, our fear for our very existence, and engage with it and practice in some way doing something different. It seems heroic to me. I'd like to finish with some words that are very, very familiar to some of us that Flint uses at the start of every retreat as a beautiful example of the expression of our core practice of sitting as a radical non-doing. Flint says in his talk at the beginning of retreats, as we sit in relative stillness and silence, this simple sitting is not an engagement in the next activity that we label as meditation or spiritual. It's the very simple enactment of non-action. Your body-mind experiences sensations of tension or pleasure, relaxation, fear, doubt, longing. If you invite your body-mind to simply sit and not do anything about that, and not ignore any of that, something new is possible. Without resorting to an alternative of action and doing called meditation, it's not required. It's not required to call it anything. It's not required to engage in any activity. Activity is most often in order to solve something or get rid of something or achieve something. But how simple are you willing to let this be? And we might in our minds expand that to life in general, beyond the retreat setting. How simple are we willing to let this be without constructing something? And in the retreat setting, he adds something called, without constructing something called meditation. As Flint's teacher, Blanche Hartman, once said fiercely to him, never imagine that you do Zazen. Zazen does Zazen. And just to round off with, I would like to offer a modified version of that. Let us never imagine that we do life. Life does life.